My name is Laura Gibson. As a major in the United States Army, I thought I had seen every battlefield imaginable. But I was wrong. The most brutal battle of my life didn't happen in a desert under mortar fire. It took place in a luxury restaurant in Charleston, under the soft glow of candlelight. The man I had been married to for 23 years, Gregory, calmly announced in front of my children, "I've found someone else. I'm done pretending." But the real shock came from my mother-in-law, Janet. She smiled, patted her son's hand, and said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, "Good for you, son. You're finally free of that ice witch." What they didn't know was that for the past 6 months, while I was deployed halfway across the world, I wasn't just fighting for my country. I was planning for this exact war. They thought they were starting a fight. They had no idea they were walking into a perfectly laid trap. If you have ever had your sacrifices thrown back in your face by the very people you did it for, let me know where you're watching from. Hit that subscribe button and get ready for a story of strategy, betrayal, and brutally executed justice. The air in Hall's Chop House in Charleston hung thick and warm, rich with the smell of perfectly seared USDA prime steaks and old leather. It was the kind of place you went to celebrate milestones, a sanctuary of dark wood and hushed, respectful service where the outside world couldn't touch you. Or so I thought. The candlelight danced across the crisp white tablecloth, catching the rim of my wine glass and casting a gentle glow on the faces of my children. Chloe, 17 and sharp as a tack, was recounting a story from school, her laughter echoing the clinking of silverware. Tyler, 14 and usually glued to his phone, was actually engaged, a small smile playing on his lips. Across from me, my husband Gregory sat beside his mother, Janet, and his father, Walter. It was a perfect picture of a family reunited. For me, this night was more than just dinner. It was a symbol. It was me, trading my combat boots for a pair of elegant heels. It was me, in a silk dress instead of a stiff, suffocating uniform. After 6 long months in a place where the only colors were sand and camouflage, sitting here felt like breathing in full color for the first time. I looked at my children and felt that familiar ache in my chest, a sharp, poignant mix of love and guilt. I'd missed birthdays. I'd missed Christmases celebrated over a grainy video call. I'd missed first dates and soccer games. This dinner was my attempt to bridge those gaps, to reclaim a piece of the peace I fought for but so rarely got to experience. This was supposed to be my reward, a fragile, beautiful, and utterly fake moment of tranquility. The calm before the storm wasn't just calm, it was a meticulously crafted illusion, and I was its last believer. The main courses had been cleared, and the waiter was describing the dessert menu when Gregory gently placed his fork and knife together on his plate. He did it with the kind of precision I'd seen in soldiers disarming a bomb, a quiet, deliberate finality. He didn't look at me. His gaze was fixed on something outside the window, somewhere over the dark, churning waters of the Charleston harbor. Then, he spoke. His voice was calm, almost bored, like he was announcing the weather forecast. "I've found someone new," he said. The words didn't explode. They simply arrived, cold and heavy, sucking all the warmth and noise out of the room. I felt the air shift. Chloe's fork clattered onto her plate. Tyler froze, his mouth half open. Walter, my father-in-law, a man of quiet integrity, just stared at his son, his brow furrowed in disbelief. I watched it all unfold as if from a great distance, a commander observing enemy movements on a screen. But the killing blow didn't come from Gregory. It came from his mother. Janet, who had been listening with a serene expression, reached over and patted Gregory's hand. A slow, satisfied smile spread across her face, a smile that held 20 years of resentment. She leaned forward, her voice just loud enough to cut through the stunned silence. "Good for you, son," she purred. "You're finally free of that ice witch." Ice witch. The phrase landed like a precision strike, hitting the exact coordinates of my deepest insecurity. It wasn't just an insult, it was a verdict. It confirmed everything I had secretly feared for years. They didn't just not love me, they despised the very core of who I was. The discipline, the strength, The career that had paid for this very meal, this beautiful house, their comfortable lives, it was all, in their eyes, a character flaw. My sacrifice wasn't a gift. It was a burden they were finally shedding. In that moment, something inside me didn't break. It solidified. The heartbroken wife receded, and the major stepped forward. I felt the familiar, cold surge of adrenaline that came before a critical mission. My breathing steadied. My movements became deliberate, precise. They thought they had cornered me, shamed me into submission in front of my children. They had miscalculated. They had forgotten who I was. Slowly, I reached for my Louis Vuitton handbag on the chair beside me. It was a purse I'd bought for myself at the duty-free shop in Dubai on my way home from Afghanistan, a private celebration of survival. It was a symbol of my own earnings, my own resilience. Their eyes followed my hand as I unclasped it and pulled out a thick, manila envelope. I slid it across the polished wood table. It stopped directly in front of Gregory. "What is this?" he asked, his voice wavering for the first time. "Open it," I said, my tone flat, devoid of emotion. His hands trembled slightly as he broke the seal. The look on his face shifted through a series of rapid-fire emotions I had been trained to read. First, arrogant confusion. Then, as he pulled out the papers, dawning realization. His eyes scanned the first page, then the second. His face drained of all color. He looked up at me, his expression turning to sheer, unadulterated panic. The self-assured man from 30 seconds ago was gone, replaced by a cornered animal. "These are divorce papers," he stammered, his voice a choked whisper. "Laura, they've already been filed." 3 days ago, I confirmed calmly. I let him absorb that for a moment before delivering the next volley. "Keep reading. You'll find Appendix A particularly interesting. It's a full accounting of the joint savings account, specifically the $109,850 you illegally transferred to your mother's name over the last year." I turned my gaze to Janet, whose smug smile had vanished, replaced by a mask of pale horror. "And then there's Appendix B, the evidence of your affairs, plural, complete with hotel receipts paid for with my supplementary credit card." Gregory's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked utterly terrified. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a low, clear command. "All our joint accounts have been frozen. A motion was granted by an emergency judge this morning, citing financial fraud." I stood up, smoothing the front of my silk dress. My movements were steady, controlled. I looked past Gregory, past Janet, and met the stunned gaze of Walter. "I'm sorry, Dad," I said, and my voice was sincere. He was a good man caught in the shrapnel of his son's betrayal. That apology drew a clear line in the sand. He was family. They were the enemy. Then I turned my attention back to my husband of 23 years. He was sputtering, his face a grotesque mixture of fear and rage. I delivered the final, decisive blow. "You can call your new girlfriend to pay for this meal," I said, my voice cutting through the air like glass. "Because your credit card, much like our marriage, has been deactivated." I didn't wait for a response. I turned, walked over to my children, and said softly, "Chloe, Tyler, we're leaving." Without a backward glance, I walked out of the restaurant, my children trailing silently behind me, leaving behind the ruins of a family and an enemy who had been completely and utterly neutralized in the first shot of a war he never even saw coming. The first shot had been fired. The enemy was neutralized. But this battle didn't start tonight. It started years ago. How did I get here? Sitting in my car in the cool, quiet dark of the restaurant parking lot, with Chloe and Tyler silent in the back seat, the adrenaline from the confrontation began to drain away, leaving a hollow ache in its place. The battle had been won. But the war. The war had been raging for years, a slow, corrosive conflict fought not with weapons, but with words and silences. Janet's parting shot that night, "I switch," wasn't a new attack. It was just the loudest echo of 20 years of quiet contempt, a contempt that had been the background noise of my entire marriage. A map of injustice is not drawn overnight. It's etched, line by painful line, over years of small, deliberate cruelties. My mind drifted back to a Christmas 2 years ago. I was at Kandahar Airfield in Afghanistan, surrounded by the perpetual dust and the distant roar of jets. The air smelled of sand and diesel fuel. It was 100 degrees during the day and freezing at night. But my mission that week wasn't tactical. It was personal. I spent hours on a satellite internet connection that was slower than molasses, painstakingly ordering the perfect gifts for my family. A designer handbag for Chloe, the newest gaming console for Tyler, a set of expensive cigars for Walter. And for Gregory, a Rolex. A beautiful classic timepiece that cost a significant chunk of my combat pay. I tracked the shipments obsessively, coordinating with neighbors to make sure everything arrived in Charleston and was wrapped under the tree. I wanted, more than anything, to give them a perfect Christmas, even if I couldn't be there. On Christmas morning, I huddled in a communications tent at 3 a.m. my time to make the video call. Their faces appeared on my laptop screen, blurry and pixelated, surrounded by the warm glow of our living room. I watched as Gregory opened his gift. He held up the Rolex, examined it for a moment, and then set it aside with a barely audible mutter. "It's fine," he said, before turning to talk to Janet about football. My heart sank. Then Janet leaned into the camera frame, her smile sharp and condescending. My, she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "That danger pay must be nice. But presents don't replace a wife, Laura." And just like that, my desperate attempt to connect, to show my love across 7,000 miles, was twisted into proof of my failure. I wasn't a loving wife trying her best. I was an absent mother buying her family's affection. The Rolex wasn't a gift. It was a transaction. I ended the call, sat alone in that cold tent, and felt a loneliness so profound it was a physical weight on my chest. That was the theme of my homecomings, too. I would return from a deployment, my body exhausted and my mind still wired for high alert, only to feel like an intruder in my own home. Gregory and Janet had their own ecosystem. They had inside jokes I didn't get, routines I disrupted, a shared life built in the negative space of my absence. To them, I wasn't Laura, their wife and daughter-in-law. I was Major Gibson. Gregory would introduce me that way at parties, a little smirk on his face. "This is my wife, Major Gibson," he'd say, as if my rank was a novelty act. Once, I overheard him talking to a friend on the patio. "My wife's a robot," he'd said with a laugh. "You just wind her up, she goes to work, makes the money, no emotions needed." I realized then that while I was facing life and death, they were building a comfortable existence funded by it. My presence wasn't a joy, it was an interruption. My career wasn't a source of pride for them, it was a convenient, high-yield investment. I was no longer a person, I was a provider, a machine. Janet was the chief architect of this narrative. She was a master of subtle psychological warfare. She would constantly compare me to other military wives, the normal ones, as she put it, who knew their place was at home, supporting their husbands. "A man needs a soft woman to come home to, Laura," she'd tell me over coffee, her expression one of deep concern. Not a commanding officer. She perfected the art of the backhanded compliment, the concerned tone that was actually a criticism. She would accidentally mention the attractive young women Gregory met through his so-called consulting business, planting seeds of discontent, subtly giving him permission to look elsewhere. She was validating his resentment, convincing him that his eventual infidelity wasn't a betrayal, but a justified search for the softness his ice witch wife could never provide. I remember another time, years earlier, when I called home from Iraq. It was the middle of the night for me, but it was Super Bowl Sunday, back in the States. All I wanted was to hear my family's voices for 5 minutes, a lifeline to normalcy. Janet answered the phone. "Oh, it's you," she said, her voice flat with annoyance. "Gregory is busy. He's watching the Super Bowl with his friends. Don't be a bother." And she hung up. Not, "He'll call you back." Not, "Is everything okay?" Just, "Don't be a bother." I was in a war zone, and to my own family, I was an inconvenience. The first time I allowed myself to truly suspect something was wrong was about a year before the dinner. I was in the Mojave Desert for a grueling training exercise at Fort Irwin. The heat was oppressive, the work relentless. When I finally got a moment to check our joint credit card statement online, I saw a charge for over $3,000 from the Breakers, a luxury resort in Palm Beach, Florida. I knew for a fact that Gregory was supposed to be in Charleston. When I got home a week later, I confronted him. I tried to be calm, to present it as a simple question. But he exploded. He didn't just deny it, he attacked me. He accused me of being paranoid, of being controlling. "This is your military mind, Laura," he yelled, his face red with fury. "You can't just turn it off. You have to analyze everything, suspect everyone. I was there for a business meeting. Am I not allowed to have a life while you're off playing soldier?" He turned it around so effectively that by the end of the argument, I was the one apologizing. I felt guilty for doubting him, ashamed of my suspicious nature. It was classic gaslighting, a masterclass in manipulation. He made me believe that the problem wasn't his behavior, but my perception of it. That was the moment the fog of denial began to lift. It wasn't just suspicion anymore, it was intelligence. It was a data point that didn't fit the official story. And that was the day, in the heat of a California desert, that the seed of what I would come to call Operation Justice was planted. If you've ever been made to feel like your instincts were wrong, or that your strength was a weakness, please support this story by hitting the like button, and let me know in the comments by just typing the words, "I see you." Because for so long, I felt completely invisible. Looking back, I realize now that those little cuts, those dismissals and manipulations were the real wounds of this war. They were the 1,000 paper cuts that bled me dry long before the final, fatal blow was ever struck. A fortress isn't built in a day. It's built brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice. The cool, calculating woman who walked out of that Charleston restaurant wasn't born in that moment of betrayal. She was forged over 2 decades of lonely service, and her foundation was laid years ago, under the unforgiving Arizona sun at Fort Huachuca. I remember it like it was yesterday. I was a young second lieutenant in military intelligence, fresh out of training and full of ideals. Fort Huachuca was a shock to the system. The desert heat was a physical presence, a suffocating blanket that shimmered over the asphalt. We'd run 72-hour field exercises without sleep, learning to decode signals and analyze threats while our bodies screamed for rest. I was one of only a handful of women in my unit, and the sense of isolation was immense. I had to work twice as hard to be considered half as good, constantly fighting to prove I belonged. Back then, Gregory was still playing the part of the supportive husband. But his support was a shallow stream of empty platitudes. He complained endlessly about having to move to a dusty hellhole in Arizona for my career. He spoke of his own stalled career as if he'd been on the fast track to becoming a CEO, when in reality, he'd never held a job for more than a year. His support came with a price tag of perpetual guilt. He made me feel like my ambition was an inconvenience to his life, a debt I was accumulating with every promotion. I wasn't just fighting to prove myself to the Army, I was fighting a second, quieter war against the guilt he so expertly weaponized against me. And with every step forward in my career, the price of that guilt went up. Each new rank, each new set of insignia on my collar cost me a piece of my family life. When I pinned on my captain's bars, I missed Chloe's first school play. I saw the pictures later, her dressed as a clumsy but adorable tree, a huge smile on her face, a smile I wasn't there to see in person. When I was selected for the Command and General Staff College, a huge honor that paved the way for me to become a major, it meant a full year away from home. The goodbyes were gut-wrenching. I would sit in front of my laptop thousands of miles away, trying to memorize the changing shape of my children's faces, while Gregory sat just off-screen, sighing dramatically. His sighs were louder than any words. They were carefully orchestrated performances designed to say, "Look what you're doing to us. Look at the burden I have to carry because of you." He turned my sacrifice into his hardship, and I felt like I owed him something I could never possibly repay. The most painful moments were the ones where I felt completely helpless. I remember one night in Iraq, I was in a canvas tent at FOB Spiker, the sound of distant explosions a constant dull rhythm. A call came through on the satellite phone. It was Chloe, her voice small and shaky. She was only 9 at the time, and she had a fever of 103. Gregory was panicking. I spent the entire night awake, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and guilt, coaching him through it from a war zone. I told him where to find the children's Tylenol, how to give her a lukewarm bath to bring the fever down, how to check her breathing. I was a mother trying to care for her sick child via a crackling satellite connection, feeling the full, crushing weight of my choices. I was protecting my country, but I couldn't protect my own daughter from a fever. Meanwhile, as I was collecting scars both visible and invisible, Gregory was building his life of leisure. His consulting firm was a fiction, a barely there website, and a box of business cards. It was a respectable cover for a life of calculated idleness. As a military dependent, he had full access to the best facilities the Army had to offer. He spent his days playing golf at the lush, manicured courses on base, using the officers' club for lunch meetings with clients who never seemed to materialize. He, and by extension his mother, used TRICARE, our military health insurance, for all their needs. My service provided them with a life of comfort and security they did nothing to earn. The hypocrisy became painfully clear one afternoon when I was home on leave. I was balancing our checkbook and found a charge for $5,000 from a high-end golf pro shop. When I asked him about it, he didn't even flinch. "I needed a new set of clubs, Laura," he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "I have to maintain an image for my clients. You have to spend money to make money." I was speechless. I had just come from a place where my soldiers were risking their lives for a few $100s of hazard pay. And he was spending thousands on a hobby using our joint savings. I should have screamed. I should have thrown him out. But I just bit my tongue. I told myself it was the price of keeping the peace, of maintaining the illusion of a happy, stable family for my children. I chose their perceived stability over my own self-respect. The turning point, the moment the quiet acceptance turned into cold resolve, came late one night, a few months before everything imploded. I was at my desk in the Pentagon. It was almost midnight, and the building was quiet except for the low hum of computers. My office was covered in strategic maps of Eastern Europe, threat assessments, and intelligence reports. I was tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that coffee can't fix. I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window. Across the Potomac River, the Washington Monument stood illuminated, a brilliant white spear against the black sky. I thought about my life. I had dedicated my entire adulthood to service, to protecting something bigger than myself, to defending the Constitution, the country, the values we hold dear. My job was to anticipate threats and protect my people. But in that moment, a chilling question echoed in the silence of my office. Who is protecting me? Who was protecting my future? Who was protecting my children from the corrosive influence of their own father's selfishness and their grandmother's venom? The answer was as clear and bright as the monument outside my window. No one. No one was coming to save me. I had to be my own cavalry. In that quiet, sterile office, surrounded by the machinery of war, I made a silent vow. I would be the protector. I would be the strategist. I would be the fortress for myself and for my children. The mission was no longer about a foreign enemy on a distant battlefield. The new mission was here, at home. And for the first time, I was ready to fight for myself. In the lonely silence of my Pentagon office after that silent vow, I knew I couldn't wage this war alone. A fortress needs allies. A commander needs a general staff. For 20 years, I'd mistakenly believed my family was my support system, only to realize I was a commander utterly alone on the battlefield. That had to change. My first call was to the one person I knew would understand the terrain of betrayal better than anyone, retired Brigadier General Elizabeth Vance. General Vance had been my commanding officer and mentor years ago. She was a trailblazer, a brilliant strategist who had kicked down doors for women in the military with her steel-toed boots. She was also a two-time divorcee who had navigated the treacherous waters of high-stakes litigation with the same precision she planned military campaigns. When I finally broke down on the phone and told her everything, the affairs, the financial fraud, the soul-crushing contempt, I expected sympathy. I got something far better. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the gears turning in her mind. When she finally spoke, Her voice was like steel. No pity, just purpose. "Laura," she said, "in warfare, we do not act on emotion. We gather intelligence, we build alliances, and we choose our moment to strike. Your personal life is no different. Treat this as a campaign. Operation Justice. Your objective is to secure your assets, protect your children, and neutralize the threat. Now, let's build your team." Her words were a bucket of ice water, snapping me out of my grief and back into focus. She didn't see a heartbroken wife. She saw a fellow soldier in need of a mission plan. That single conversation rebuilt my shattered morale. I had my orders. The first step was intelligence gathering. General Vance gave me the name of a private investigator in Phoenix, where Gregory and I owned our primary home. "She's the best," Vance had said. "Ex-Army CID, she speaks our language." That's how I met Olivia, my own private intelligence unit. Olivia was nothing like the grizzled PIs you see in movies. She was a sharp, professional woman in her late 30s with a firm handshake and eyes that missed nothing. As a former Criminal Investigation Division agent, she understood the military world, and more importantly, she understood the unique sacrifices of a female soldier. I didn't have to explain the deployments, the missed holidays, the constant feeling of being torn in two. She just got it. A few weeks later, she presented her first report. The evidence was damning. Photos, timelines, financial records of Gregory's infidelity. As she laid out the glossy pictures of my husband with another woman, she looked at me, not with pity, but with a quiet, fierce solidarity. "Major," she said, her voice firm, "what he did isn't just a betrayal. It's an insult to the uniform you wear. He used the freedom and security you provided him to dishonor you. We're going to make it right." Tears welled in my eyes. For the first time, someone saw my pain not just as a spurned wife, but as a soldier whose service had been desecrated. It was a validation so profound it felt like a physical balm on a raw wound. Olivia wasn't just working for me, she was fighting alongside me. A rock-solid alliance was formed. With the intelligence secured, it was time to bring in the heavy artillery. Olivia recommended a lawyer in Phoenix named Catherine Voss. My meeting with Catherine was less like a legal consultation and more like a pre-mission briefing in a war room. Her office wasn't filled with dusty law books. It was lined with whiteboards covered in strategic diagrams and flowcharts. Catherine herself was a force of nature, a woman in her 60s with a shock of platinum blonde hair, a tailored power suit, and in gaze so sharp it felt like it could dissect you. She listened to my entire story without interruption, her fingers steepled under her chin. She reviewed Olivia's evidence, her expression unreadable. When I finished, a slow, dangerous smile spread across her face. "Excellent," she declared, her voice crisp and confident. "Our adversary is arrogant, sloppy, and overconfident. He has handed us every tactical advantage. Our mission is not to fight him head-on. Our mission is to set a trap and let his own greed and ego do the work for us." Catherine wasn't just a lawyer. She was a grandmaster of legal chess. She saw the emotional wreckage of my life and, from it, drafted a flawless plan of attack. She transformed my pain into a legal weapon. With General Vance as my advisor, Olivia as my intelligence chief, and Catherine as my ultimate weapon, Operation Justice was officially a go. I finally had a team. A real one. It made me realize that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about the people who choose to stand with you in the foxhole when the world is exploding around you. It reminded me of a Thanksgiving I spent at Bagram Airfield in Afghanistan. We had just endured a rough week, and morale was low. I was thousands of miles from my kids, feeling the ache of loneliness that always hit hardest on holidays. I was expecting to eat a dry turkey patty from a vacuum-sealed MRE pouch alone in my quarters. But my unit had other plans. They had scrounged and bartered for whatever ingredients they could find: canned cranberry sauce from the PX, potatoes from the mess hall, a questionable-looking turkey someone had procured. They cooked a feast in a makeshift kitchen. We all gathered around a long, collapsible table, a motley crew of soldiers from every corner of America, sharing stories of home and trying to forget where we were for a few hours. At one point, my master sergeant, A big burly man from Chicago named Rodriguez came over and put a heavy hand on my shoulder. "Major," he said, his voice a low rumble, "don't you worry. Out here, we're your family." In that moment, surrounded by the men and women I served with, I understood. I had never truly been alone. I had a different kind of family, one forged not in a home, but in hardship. A family built on shared sacrifice, mutual respect, and unwavering loyalty. And it was that family, the one that had my back in the deserts of Afghanistan, that gave me the strength to finally fight for myself in the battlefield of my own life. With my new team assembled, I was no longer just a wife fighting back. I was a commander with a mission. And I knew the enemy wouldn't stay silent for long. I was just waiting for their next move. With my team assembled and my strategy in place, a quiet confidence settled over me. I was a commander with a mission. But I knew the enemy wouldn't stay silent for long. And then, a few weeks before that fateful dinner, they made contact. It didn't come as a frontal assault, but as a covert infiltration, disguised as a peace offering. The first move came from Gregory. He called me late one night while I was still at my desk, reviewing intelligence reports. The caller ID flashed his name, and I let it ring twice before answering, schooling my voice into a neutral tone. "Laura," he began, his voice dripping with an artificial sweetness I hadn't heard in years. It was the voice he used when he wanted something, a cloying, syrupy sound that always set my teeth on edge. "I was just thinking about you, about us. I miss you, honey." I remained silent, listening. This was a reconnaissance mission. "I have an idea," he continued, the false enthusiasm growing. "Let's take the kids to Charleston for a long weekend. Just the family. We can stay at a nice hotel, go to that steakhouse you love. Halls. We need time for each other, to reconnect, to fix things." For a split second, a traitorous flicker of hope ignited in my chest. It was the ghost of the young woman I used to be, the one who believed in forgiveness and second chances. A part of me, however small, wanted to believe he was sincere. The wife in me wanted to fall for it. But the major in me knew better. This wasn't an olive branch. It was a tactical maneuver. He was trying to lure me onto favorable ground, to soften me up before he launched his real attack. I remembered the cold, strategic advice from my lawyer, Catherine. "Let him think he's in control," she had said. "Let him think he's winning. Arrogance will make him careless." So I took a deep breath and played my part. "Charleston sounds nice, Gregory," I said, allowing a hint of weariness into my voice. "Yes, I think we could all use that." I agreed, not from weakness, but from a position of strategic strength. He thought he was setting the stage. I knew I was setting the trap. The second wave of the psychological offensive came a few days later, this time from Janet. Her call was even more insidious, cloaked in a veil of feigned motherly concern. "Laura, dear," she began, her voice smooth as silk. "I'm so glad to hear you and Gregory are taking this trip. He's trying so hard, I could almost picture her shaking her head sadly, playing the part of the concerned matriarch. "You're such a strong woman, Laura, and we all admire that. But sometimes that strength can be intimidating to a man. Maybe you could try to be a little softer, for the sake of the family." There it was, the classic Janet maneuver. In one breath, she'd managed to praise my strength and then frame it as the root of all our problems. His infidelity wasn't his fault, it was a reaction to my strength. The blame was expertly shifted back onto me. It was a sophisticated, toxic form of psychological warfare designed to make me doubt myself, to make me wonder if maybe, just maybe, I was the one who needed to change. For years, her words had been like a slow-acting poison, making me question my own worth. But now, with my eyes wide open, I recognized them for what they were: tactical propaganda. I murmured some non-committal agreement and ended the call, a cold, hard knot of anger tightening in my stomach. Gregory saved his most powerful weapon for last. A few days before we were scheduled to leave for Charleston, he called again. The sweet, pleading tone was gone, replaced by a more serious, almost mournful one. He told me how much he loved the kids, how he couldn't imagine his life without them. And then he deployed his nuclear option. Just think about the kids, Laura, he said, his voice thick with fake emotion. Do you really want them to grow up in a broken home, all because of a mistake? Any mistake can be fixed. You're destroying this family. Chloe and Tyler will never forgive you for doing this to their father. The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs, using my children, my love for them, as a shield for his own despicable behavior. It was the cruelest form of blackmail. For a moment, I was choked with a rage so pure it felt like acid in my throat. I wanted to scream at him, to list every one of his betrayals, every lie, every dollar he'd stolen. But I didn't. I held on to my discipline. I knew that the worst thing for my children wasn't a broken home. The worst thing was growing up in a home built on a foundation of lies, disrespect, and contempt. The most powerful act of love I could show them was to demonstrate that a woman, that their mother, would not tolerate being treated this way. That self-respect was not negotiable. The final straw, the event that erased every last shred of doubt from my mind, wasn't a phone call or an argument. It was a single, silent email. It arrived in my inbox with the subject line, "Final Confirmation." It was from Olivia. Attached was a single photograph, taken with a long-range lens. It was Gregory standing outside a high-end jewelry store in Phoenix, the kind of place with velvet ropes and security guards. He was kissing a young blonde woman. But it wasn't the kiss that broke me. It was the object in his hand. He was holding a small dark blue velvet box. I recognized it instantly. It was the exact same shade of blue, the same shape, the same size as the box he had used to propose to me 24 years ago under a starry sky in Virginia. He wasn't just cheating on me. He was recycling our past. He was taking a sacred memory, a cornerstone of my life, and carelessly bestowing it upon someone else. It was the ultimate insult. It told me that our entire history was meaningless to him, a script he could just reread with a new cast member. The last flicker of hope, the ghost of the young woman who wanted to believe, died in that moment. There was no more conflict, no more doubt. There was only the cold, hard clarity of the mission ahead. I picked up my phone, my hand perfectly steady. I didn't hesitate. I dialed my lawyer. When Catherine answered, her voice was calm and professional. Catherine Voss. I took a deep breath. "It's time, Catherine," I said, my own voice a reflection of hers, cold, clear, and resolute. "File the papers. Operation Justice is a go." The moment Gregory said, "I've found someone new," a profound and deathly silence fell over our table. It was as if a vacuum had sucked all the ambient noise out of Hall's chop house, the clinking of glasses, the low murmur of conversation, the distant sizzle from the kitchen. It all just vanished. All I could hear was the blood pounding in my ears, a steady, disciplined rhythm like a metronome, like a drum beat before a charge. I took a mental snapshot of the scene, my mind processing the data with chilling clarity. Chloe sat frozen, her fork slipping from her numb fingers and clattering onto her plate, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. Tyler was completely still, a bite of creamed spinach halfway to his mouth, his eyes wide with shock. My father-in-law Walter's face was a mask of disbelief, his brows knitted together in a deep, troubled line. And then there was Janet. She was smiling, not a big, overt smile, but a small, tight, triumphant smirk. It was the final piece of intelligence I needed. That smile was the signal. It told me this wasn't a spontaneous, painful confession. This was a premeditated ambush. This was a performance, and I was the intended audience. As if on cue, Gregory launched into his rehearsed speech. He began to paint a picture of himself as a tragic victim, a man who had lost his way, who needed to find his own happiness. He spoke in vague, self-helpy cliches, carefully avoiding any real accountability. And then he turned his sights on me. "I've always supported you, Laura," he said, his voice laced with a false sincerity that made my skin crawl. "But you were never really here. Your career, the army, It created a distance between us that I just couldn't cross. Janet nodded slowly, her expression one of deep, solemn agreement. It's true, she added, her voice soft but carrying. She was always about the mission. The job came first. I felt a surge of white-hot rage, so intense it was almost blinding. This was their masterstroke. They were rewriting history in real time. My years of sacrifice, the missed birthdays, the lonely nights in war zones, the financial security my career had provided. They were twisting all of it into a narrative of my own failure. My loyalty to my country was being recast as disloyalty to my family. They were trying to make me the villain in my own life story. I remembered something I'd read from Brené Brown, a writer and researcher I deeply admired. She wrote that shame cannot survive being spoken. It thrives in silence and secrecy. And in that moment, I understood Gregory and Janet's strategy. They were using public shaming as a weapon. They expected me to crumble, to cry, to make a scene, to be humiliated into a quiet, pathetic surrender. They were about to be severely disappointed. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't even raise my voice. Instead, I let a small, cold smile touch my own lips. It was a smile that didn't reach my eyes. It was a smile that said, I see you, and I'm ready. My hand went to my Louis Vuitton bag. I felt the familiar weight of the manila envelope inside, the dense, satisfying heft of 6 months of meticulous preparation. I slid it out and placed it on the table. With a deliberate, unhurried motion, I pushed it across the polished surface. It slid to a stop directly in front of Gregory. The gesture was as clean and decisive as a general moving a key piece on a map of the battlefield. Gregory stared at the envelope as if it were a snake. I watched the cascade of expressions on his face, smug confidence giving way to confusion, then to dawning horror as his eyes flickered from the envelope to my face. What is this? He stammered. Your exit briefing, I said, my voice perfectly level. Each word was a bullet, delivered with calm precision. Inside, you'll find a petition for divorce. It was filed with the Maricopa County Superior Court 3 days ago. The blood drained from his face. Janet's jaw went slack. The smug satisfaction was gone, replaced by pure, unadulterated shock. But I wasn't finished. The first volley had landed. It was time for the full barrage. My voice remained low, but it cut through the silence like a razor. I suggest you turn to Appendix A, I said, my eyes locking onto Janet. It's a complete forensic accounting of our joint savings, detailing the wire transfers totaling $197,850 into a private account under your name, Mrs. Gibson. An act which, under Arizona law, constitutes financial fraud. Janet let out a small, strangled gasp. I shifted my gaze back to Gregory. Then there's Appendix B. It's a comprehensive file compiled by my investigator. It details your relationships with not one, but 3 other women over the past 18 months. It includes copies of hotel bills from the Ritz-Carlton in Miami, the resort in Palm Beach, and a lovely little bed and breakfast in Savannah, all paid for with the supplementary credit card I gave you for emergencies. His face was a grotesque mask of terror. He was cornered, and he knew it. And finally, I said, leaning forward slightly, there's Appendix C, transcripts of text messages recovered from your cloud backup, the ones where you refer to me as your ice witch and your personal ATM while you were spending my combat pay on expensive jewelry for your mistresses. The silence that followed was absolute. They were utterly broken, their ambush shattered, their lies exposed. I had taken their weapon of public shame and turned it back on them with devastating force. If you have ever dreamed of a moment where you could finally stand up and speak your truth with this kind of undeniable proof, hit that like button to stand with me. And in the comments, just write one word. Boom. Let them hear it. Slowly, I stood up. I took my wallet from my purse and pulled out 5 crisp $100 bills, placing them on the table. I caught the eye of our bewildered waiter. This is for my meal, and for my children's, I said clearly. As for the rest, this gentleman will be taking care of it. I then turned to my children. Chloe was staring at me, her mouth slightly agape, a look of stunned admiration in her eyes. Tyler looked like he'd just witnessed a superhero landing. Chloe, Tyler, I said, my voice softening for the first time. Let's go home. Without another word, without a single backward glance, I turned and walked away, my children falling into step behind me. I didn't need to look back. I knew what I was leaving behind. The wreckage of a 23-year lie and an enemy completely and utterly defeated on a battlefield of his own choosing. The drive home from the restaurant was silent. Chloe and Tyler sat in the back, the shock of the evening wrapping them in a quiet blanket. As soon as I pulled into our garage, my phone, which I had put on silent, lit up the dark car. And it didn't stop. Call after call. Gregory, Janet. Gregory again. Then Janet. It was a relentless digital assault. I walked into the house, plugged the phone into its charger on the kitchen counter, and simply watched it buzz and light up, a frantic, desperate beacon in the quiet room. I didn't answer. Catherine had been crystal clear in her instructions. Do not engage, let them talk. Panicked people make mistakes. So I let them. I let every call go to voicemail. Later that night, after the kids were in their rooms, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and listened to the messages. It was like listening to the complete psychological unraveling of two narcissists. The first voicemails were full of blustering rage and threats of legal action. Then the tone shifted to desperate, tearful pleading, begging me to think about what I was doing. Finally, it circled back to blame, with Janet accusing me of being a cruel, vindictive monster for airing our private business in public. Their panicked, contradictory ramblings were better than any confession. Listening to them, I didn't feel a surge of triumph or glee. I felt a cold, hard certainty, a quiet confirmation that I had made the absolute right decision. Every word they spoke was another nail in their own coffin. The next morning, it was time for our war council. I logged onto a secure video call from my home office. On the screen, two faces popped up. Catherine, my legal grandmaster in Phoenix, and Olivia, my intelligence chief. It felt exactly like a morning intelligence briefing. Olivia went first, sharing her screen. Final confirmation on the adversary's movements, she said, her tone all business. She displayed flight itineraries, car rental agreements, and hotel bookings for Gregory and his primary mistress, all meticulously documented. He's not just sloppy, he's arrogant. He made no effort to hide his tracks. Then Catherine took over. All right, Laura, let's review the phases of attack, she said, pulling up a flowchart on her screen. Phase 1, asset neutralization. That was executed perfectly last night. All joint accounts are frozen. His access to your credit is cut off. He's financially isolated, she continued. Phase 2, protective measures. I'm filing for an emergency temporary restraining order this morning, citing his threatening voicemails. And we will file for temporary full custody of the children. Phase 3, full-scale assault. At the preliminary hearing, we will present the evidence of financial fraud and adultery. Our objective is not just to win the divorce, but to claw back every single dollar he and his mother stole. And Laura, she added, her eyes sharp, don't forget our ace in the hole. She was referring to the Uniform Code of Military Justice. As a military spouse, Gregory was subject to certain aspects of it. Adultery, under the UCMJ, is a punishable offense. Financial fraud against a service member, especially while they're deployed, is taken extremely seriously. A conviction could not only have legal consequences, but could also impact his right to any portion of my military pension. It was a powerful piece of leverage. I found myself nodding, contributing my own analysis. They'll play the victim, I said. Gregory's next move will be to try and manipulate the children. Janet will launch a smear campaign among our mutual friends. We need to anticipate and counter these moves. We were a perfect team. Logical, strategic, and completely focused. For the first time in this nightmare, I felt powerful. I felt safe. But the next step was the one I dreaded most. I had to brief my children. That afternoon, I sat them down on the living room couch. I didn't want to poison them against their father, but they deserved the truth. I approached it like a situational report, calmly, factually, without emotional embellishment. Your father and I are getting a divorce, I began. I explained that he had made some choices that broke the trust in our family. I told them about the money, in simple terms. I told them he had another relationship. I even showed them a single, non-salacious piece of evidence, a credit card statement showing a charge for a woman's diamond necklace. I braced myself for tears, for anger, for accusations. What I got was something else entirely. Chloe, my stoic, observant daughter, just looked at me and shook her head. "Mom, I'm not stupid," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm not a little kid anymore. I've seen how he treats you, how Grandma talks to you. I've seen it for years. Honestly," she took a breath, "I'm just glad you're finally doing something about it." I was stunned into silence. Then, Tyler, my quiet, sensitive son, who had been staring at the floor, simply leaned over and wrapped his arms around me in a tight hug. He didn't say a word, but his embrace told me everything I needed to know. It was a hug of unconditional support, of love, of relief. In that moment, I knew this wasn't just my fight. It was ours. This wasn't a bitter divorce. It was a mission to protect our real family, the three of us. Their support was the armor I never knew I had. About a week later, I received one more phone call. It was from Walter, my father-in-law. I was hesitant to answer, but I did. His voice was heavy with shame. "Laura," he said, and he sounded 10 years older. "I am so ashamed. I had no idea about the money. I promise you. But I know what I saw at that restaurant. There is no excuse for what Gregory did, for what my wife did. I want you to know, I'm on your side. I'm on your side and the kids' side." Tears pricked my eyes. He had no idea what that call meant to me. It was a lifeline of decency in an ocean of deceit. It was confirmation that the entire family wasn't rotten to the core. It was a small but powerful light in the darkness. After I hung up, I called Catherine to update her. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Walter's support is a significant moral victory, Laura. It isolates Gregory from the one person whose opinion he might actually respect. But the real battle is ahead." I could hear her typing. "The date for the preliminary hearing has been set. The courtroom is our designated battlefield. Be ready." Catherine's final words to me before the hearing were, "Be ready." And I was. The day of the preliminary hearing, I walked into the sterile, imposing Maricopa County Courthouse, feeling not like a victim, but like a soldier entering her designated battlefield. I wore a sharply tailored navy blue suit, a set of clothes that felt like its own kind of armor. Authoritative, but not my military uniform. This was a civilian battle, and I was dressed for it. Across the courtroom, Gregory and Janet sat huddled with their lawyer. They looked tired, their arrogance from the restaurant replaced with a nervous, frayed energy. Gregory's lawyer was a slick, polished man named Peterson with a shark smile and expensive shoes. He used a kind of manufactured confidence that I'd seen 1,000 times before. Catherine had briefed me on their strategy. "They have no facts," she'd said, "so they will attack your character. Let them. Let them walk right into the kill zone." So I sat ramrod straight beside Catherine, my hands clasped calmly in my lap, and I waited. Peterson began by painting a masterful fictional portrait of my husband. He described Gregory as a devoted, long-suffering man, a husband left behind while his wife chased glory around the globe. He spoke of Gregory's unwavering support for my career, conveniently omitting that my career was his only source of income. He was trying to sell a narrative of the neglected husband, hoping to win the court's sympathy. I kept my expression neutral, my gaze fixed on the judge, just as Catherine had instructed. We were letting him exhaust his ammunition on a target that wasn't there. Then Peterson deployed his heavy weapon. He cleared his throat, adopted a somber tone, and turned his attention to me. "Your Honor," he said, his voice filled with false concern, "we have the utmost respect for Major Gibson's service to our country. However, her file indicates multiple combat deployments to hostile fire zones. We are concerned that these traumatic experiences may have lingering effects." He paused for dramatic effect. "We are concerned about her mental stability, and therefore her fitness as a primary custodial parent." A wave of cold fury washed over me. This was it. The lowest blow. He was attempting to weaponize my service, to turn my sacrifice, my dedication, my scars into a disqualification for motherhood. It was a vile, despicable tactic, an insult to every man and woman who has ever worn the uniform. I could feel my hands clench into fists beneath the table, but on the surface, I remained a statue of calm. I would not give them the satisfaction of an emotional reaction. Catherine rose slowly. She didn't object. She didn't raise her voice. She simply walked to the projector and said, "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I would like to present some evidence regarding Mr. Gibson's character and financial activities." The judge, a stern, no-nonsense woman in her 60s named Holbrook, nodded. "Proceed, counselor." One by one, Catherine projected the evidence onto the large screen for the entire courtroom to see. First, the bank statements. The clear, undeniable trail of nearly $200,000 flowing from our joint account into Janet's. With each new document, Catherine would turn to Peterson and ask the same, simple question in a calm, almost gentle voice. "Counselor, do you dispute the authenticity of this document?" Peterson, looking increasingly flustered, could only mutter, "No, we do not." Next, the photos from Olivia. Gregory with his arms around a blonde in Miami. Gregory laughing with a brunette in Savannah. The hotel bills, all itemized, all paid for, with my credit card. "Counselor," Catherine repeated, her voice like a steady drumbeat, "do you dispute the authenticity of these photographs and receipts?" "We do not," he mumbled, refusing to make eye contact. Then came the text messages, blown up on the screen in damning black and white. "The ice switch is deployed again. Time to live a little. Just have to wait for the ATM to wire more cash." The courtroom was utterly silent, the only sound the quiet click of Catherine's remote. Gregory stared at the screen, his face pale and slick with sweat. Janet looked like she might faint. "Finally, Your Honor," Catherine said, her voice still perfectly even. "The plaintiff would like to call a surprise witness to the stand. We call Walter Gibson." A ripple of shock went through the courtroom. Gregory whipped his head around to stare at his father, his eyes wide with betrayal. Walter, his face etched with a deep, sorrowful resolve, walked steadily to the witness stand and was sworn in. Catherine's questions were simple and direct. "Mr. Gibson, to your knowledge, has your son Gregory held a steady job in the last 10 years? Walter cleared his throat. "No, he has not." "And to your knowledge, who has been the sole financial provider for your son, your daughter-in-law, and their children during that time?" Walter looked directly at me, his eyes full of regret. "Laura has," he said, his voice clear and strong. "Everything they have is because of her. My son has been living off his wife's military salary for his entire adult life." It was devastating. Peterson had no questions. When Walter stepped down, Judge Holbrook removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. She looked at all of us for a long, silent moment. Then, her gaze settled on Gregory's lawyer. "Counselor," she said, her voice cold and sharp as chipped ice, "your attempt to weaponize Major Gibson's honorable service to this country against her is, without a doubt, one of the most despicable legal tactics I have ever witnessed in this courtroom." Peterson shrank in his chair. Then she turned to Gregory. "And Mr. Gibson," she continued, her voice dripping with contempt, "you are not the victim here. Your wife served this country, and you repaid her by draining her bank account and cheating on her. You are not a neglected husband. You are a con man." Gregory and Janet sat frozen, their faces masks of stunned disbelief. The judge's gavel came down with a sharp, final crack. "The court's ruling is as follows," she declared, her voice ringing with authority. "Temporary sole legal and physical custody of the minor children is awarded to the plaintiff, Major Laura Gibson. The defendant will have supervised visitation only. Furthermore, the defendant is ordered to repay the full amount of $197,850 to the plaintiff within 30 days, pending a final settlement. This hearing is adjourned." It was over. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt a release. A profound and overwhelming sense of relief, as if a 2-ton weight I had been carrying for 23 years had finally been lifted from my shoulders. The truth was out. Justice, in its slow, methodical way, had finally been served. Walking out of the courthouse that day, I expected to feel triumphant, vindicated. Instead, I just felt empty. I drove home in a daze, the adrenaline of the courtroom battle seeping away, leaving behind a profound and hollow exhaustion. It felt like the end of a long, grueling deployment. The mission is over, the threat is neutralized, but your body and mind are still vibrating from the strain. I didn't celebrate. There were no champagne toasts or victory laps. I simply walked into my quiet house, sat down on the living room sofa, and let the silence wash over me. The victory in court was also a confirmation of a total loss. I had lost 23 years of my life to a lie. I had lost the man I once loved, the father of my children. I had lost the very idea of the family I thought I was fighting to protect. And in that quiet moment, I finally allowed myself to cry. Not for Gregory, not out of anger or pity for him. I cried for the naive young woman who had walked down the aisle, full of hope. I cried for the exhausted captain who coached her husband through their daughter's fever from a war zone. I cried for the woman who had believed, for far too long, that her sacrifice would one day be seen and valued. I was mourning her, because after today, she was gone forever. It was in that moment of raw, quiet vulnerability that my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered it anyway. A young woman's voice, trembling and hesitant, came through the line. Is this Laura Gibson? Yes, it is, I said, my voice still thick from crying. My name is Cassidy, she said, her voice cracking. I think you have a right to know. I'm pregnant, and it's Gregory's. The world tilted on its axis. It felt like another physical blow, a vicious sucker punch after the main fight was already over. A new, fresh layer of pain settled over the old. But then, after the initial shock receded, a different feeling emerged, rising through the pain like a beacon. Absolute, crystalline clarity. This news, as devastating as it was a gift. It was the final, brutal piece of intelligence that wiped away any lingering wisps of what if. What if we'd gone to counseling? What if I'd been softer, like Janet wanted? This biological bomb vaporized all of it. It was the ultimate proof that Gregory was not a man who had made a mistake. He was a man who created wreckage wherever he went. There was nothing left to save. There was nothing left to mourn. Thank you for telling me, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. Then I hung up and immediately called Catherine. As expected, Gregory failed to meet the court-ordered 30-day deadline to repay the money. At the subsequent contempt hearing, Judge Holbrook was not amused. She gave him an ultimatum, her voice like ice. Repay the full amount within 1 week, or she would issue a warrant for his arrest. Jail time. That was the move that finally forced Janet's hand. The thought of her precious son, her perfect boy, trading his golf shirts for a prison jumpsuit was more than she could bear. I didn't have to do a thing. I just sat back and watched the consequences unfold. Olivia sent me the link to the real estate listing. Janet had to sell the beautiful historic house in downtown Charleston she was so proud of, the one she loved to boast about. She had to sell her antique furniture, her silver, her paintings. It wasn't the revenge I sought, but it was the direct and unavoidable outcome of her greed and her complicity. A week later, a cashier's check for the full amount was delivered to Catherine's office. The money was wired into a new trust account I had set up for my children. It didn't feel like a victory. It felt like justice being restored, like a debt finally being paid. A few days before the final divorce hearing, Walter called and asked to meet me for coffee. We met at a small, quiet cafe in Phoenix. He looked 10 years older, the light in his eyes dimmed. He didn't make excuses for his son. Laura, he said, stirring his coffee without looking at me. I've filed for divorce from Janet. I can't live with a woman who would knowingly and willingly participate in something so cruel, who would help her son steal from the mother of her own grandchildren. He finally looked up, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. He pushed a small envelope across the table. Inside was a personal check. It wasn't a large amount, but that wasn't the point. This isn't about the money, he said, his voice thick with emotion. This is an apology. For my part in all of this, for not seeing what was happening in my own house, Please, he pleaded. Just let me continue to be grandpa to Chloe and Tyler. They're all I have left. I pushed the check back towards him. I accept your apology, Walter, I said softly. But I can't take your money, and you will always be their grandfather. That was never in question. That conversation was a turning point. It taught me that I didn't have to burn the entire world down. I didn't have to let bitterness consume me. I could draw firm, clear boundaries. I could cut out the toxic parts and still hold on to the small sliver of good that remained. Forgiveness, I was beginning to understand, wasn't about absolving Gregory or Janet. They would never get that from me. Forgiveness was about me. It was about releasing myself from the weight of my own anger so that it wouldn't poison my future. That night, I sat on my bed and scrolled through the contacts on my phone. I stopped at his name. Gregory. For 23 years, that name had been my emergency contact, my +1, my home base. I looked at it for a long time, thinking of the man I married, the father he once was, and the stranger he had become. There was a brief pang of sadness, a final faint echo of the life we once shared. Then, with a steady finger, I pressed edit, scrolled to the bottom of the screen, and tapped the red letters that read, Delete Contact. It was done. The last tie was severed. The war was finally over. The final divorce hearing was little more than a formality. The real war had already been won. The courtroom felt different this time, less like a battlefield and more like a place for signing a peace treaty. Gregory sat on the other side of the room, looking like a hollowed-out version of his former self. He was gaunt, defeated. The arrogant, self-assured man from the restaurant was gone, replaced by a ghost. He'd lost his wife, his comfortable lifestyle, the respect of his children, and the admiration of his father. He had lost everything. Before issuing the final decree, Judge Holbrook asked if he had anything to say. He stood up slowly, his movements stiff. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes that wasn't anger or arrogance. It was a deep, pathetic emptiness. I'm sorry, Laura, he stammered, the words catching in his throat. I looked back at him, and to my own surprise, I felt nothing. No anger, no pain, not even the cold satisfaction of victory. All I felt was a distant, detached sense of pity. It was the kind of pity you feel for a stranger who has made a series of terrible life choices. His apology wasn't for me. It was a lament for himself, for the life he had so carelessly thrown away. I simply nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement, not acceptance. A moment later, the judge's gavel came down one last time. The marriage is hereby dissolved, she declared. I walked out of the courthouse and into the bright, dry heat of the Arizona sun. I stopped on the steps, closed my eyes, and took a deep, cleansing breath. The air was clean, the sky was a vast, cloudless blue. And in that moment, I felt a sense of freedom so pure and profound it was almost dizzying. The war was over. I had survived. 2 years have passed since that day. Life is different now. It's quieter. It's calmer. It's mine. I'm still serving in the army, but something has shifted. I'm no longer doing it to prove my worth to anyone or to provide for a man who saw me as an ATM. I'm doing it for myself, for the country I love, and for the pride I take in my work. Last year, I was promoted to lieutenant colonel. My children are thriving. Chloe is in her sophomore year at UC San Diego, studying marine biology and shining brighter than I've ever seen her. Tyler, after some time working with a therapist to process everything, has blossomed. He's the captain of his high school's robotics team, a strong, funny, and remarkably well-adjusted young man. Our house is no longer a place of unspoken tension and simmering resentment. It's filled with laughter now. With Friday night pizza and movie marathons, with open, honest conversations. We are a small unit, but we are a happy one. I've started discovering the person who exists outside the uniform and outside the title of Mrs. Gibson. I've taken up hiking, exploring the beautiful red rock trails of Sedona on the weekends. I joined a pottery class. And there's something profoundly therapeutic about taking a shapeless lump of clay and turning it into something whole and beautiful. I am rediscovering Laura. As for Gregory and Janet, Their story is not a chapter in my book anymore, it's a footnote. I hear snippets of information from Walter from time to time. Gregory moved to Nevada, chasing some get-rich-quick scheme. He works odd jobs, struggling to make child support payments for his son with Cassidy. He calls Chloe and Tyler sometimes, but the calls have become less and less frequent. He has, through his own actions, become an outsider in his children's lives, a distant, cautionary tale. Janet lives alone in a small rental apartment, bitter and isolated. Her health has declined, and her anger has only grown. Their fate isn't a source of pleasure for me. It's simply a lesson in consequences. It is the natural outcome of a life built on greed and arrogance. It is not my victory. It is their self-inflicted defeat. There's a quote by Eleanor Roosevelt that I think about often now. No one can make you feel inferior without your consent. For 23 years, I'd unknowingly given Gregory and Janet my consent. I'd allowed their words, their sighs, their contempt to define my worth. The 6-month battle to end my marriage wasn't just about money or infidelity. It was about me, formally and irrevocably, revoking my consent. Which brings me here, to this evening. I'm standing in my backyard in Phoenix, a glass of iced tea in my hand. The sun is setting behind Camelback Mountain, painting the desert sky in fiery shades of orange, pink, and purple. It's peaceful. I used to think the sweetest revenge would be watching them lose everything. But I was wrong. I've come to realize that the best revenge isn't about destroying someone else's life. It's about building your own into something so beautiful and peaceful that their existence becomes completely irrelevant. My victory wasn't the $200,000. It wasn't the house or the custody of my children. It wasn't even the look of utter defeat on Gregory's face in that courtroom. The real victory is this moment, right here. The quiet hum of the cicadas, the cool glass in my hand, the knowledge that my happiness is no longer dependent on anyone else's approval or presence. It is built by me, for me. I spent 6 months planning a battle, but I've spent the last 2 years building a peace. And for a soldier, peace is the final, most glorious victory of all. My battlefield is quiet now, and my greatest hope is that yours can be too. This journey has taught me that our value is never determined by those who refuse to see it. It's forged in the quiet moments we decide to fight for ourselves. If my story resonated with you, and if you believe in the power of building your own dawn after the longest night, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. We share stories here not just of survival, but of thriving. And in the comments, I'd be honored if you would share one simple thing that brings you peace. Let's fill this space with what truly matters.